I'd like to talk a little bit at first about the very idea of planes and parts of being, because we can first ask the question as to whether there are planes and parts of the being, and which being are we talking about? What is the being? And if we use the term the being with a capital B, then Sri Aurobindo is looking at the Indian tradition and translating the word Brahman. Brahman is, one may say, the only being there is. And the only being there is means that there is just one reality, and that reality is being. So the question of planes and parts of the being comes to us as experiencers because we experience an ordered universe, a universe that seems to have differences in kinds of realities. And at first, we may not be very clear about that. We intuit it. We intuit different kinds of realities that we inhabit simultaneously. But we may not be very clear about any sort of ordering of this reality. So the being has to be first thought about without any planes and parts. And I'd like to reference the Isha Upanishad and a key line in the Isha Upanishad, which I have actually written a book on. In case any of you are interested, it has just come out. It's called Meditations on the Isha Upanishad, Tracing the Philosophical Vision of Sri Aurobindo. So in the Isha Upanishad, I point to one particular stanza. This is verse 8 in the Upanishad. And Sri Aurobindo's translation of this verse goes, "It is he that has gone abroad, that which is bright, bodiless, without scar of imperfection, without sinews, pure, unpierced by evil. The seer, the thinker, the one who becomes everywhere, the self-existent, has ordered objects perfectly according to their nature from years sempiternal." And this is a very profound stanza that Sri Aurobindo spends a lot of time discussing in his commentary on the Isha Upanishad. But the first thing to note about this is this notion of the being who doesn't have any parts or planes, the being that is without sinews, without musculature, without any differentiation. So it is this being that has gone forth, that has gone abroad. And then the going abroad is then explained in terms of certain functions or operations of being. Now, how do those operations come about is not really explained here, but these operations are given as a succession that is represented by certain operations of consciousness. The first one being that of the poet, the seer. They're using the term, they're actually using the term kavi, kavir, kavi. Kavi is being translated by Sri Aurobindo here as the seer. And kavi literally means the poet, because the poet is the seer. It's the Vedic seer. He sees and manifests. It's also the ancient Greek idea of poiesis. Poiesis is revelation, self-revelation. So the seer, the poet, observes itself, knows itself, sees itself as a being, and then what it sees, it manifests in the orders of being. That's the thinker. The thinker cognizes the various parts that the poet sees spontaneously, and then the one becomes what is seen. The one who becomes everywhere, becomes whatever is seen. And this seeing is done according to an order. The self-existent has ordered objects perfectly according to their nature from years sempiternal. So this principle of ordering, we can see it's a very complex verse in which we find that there is a principle of ordering through which the being who is unordered comes into manifestation in a certain order. And then it is also expressed in a way that makes it clear that there is no time to this. This has happened at an original time, a time of origin. You see? Now, what is a time of origin? And this is something very mysterious. Sri Aurobindo touches on it, and he uses a certain phrase for these kinds of what we may call events. The word event itself implies time. An event occurs in time. But Sri Aurobindo uses a certain phrase in the Life Divine. He talks about eternal events or events in eternity. So this is a very provocative phrase that I'd like us all to reflect on. An eternal event or an event in eternity is something which is bridging eternity and time. It is giving birth to time. We can call it an image of time, an image of time. And we can see some of these images. One of these images, in fact, the Veda and the Upanishad give us many such images. The image of the sacrifice of Purusha is such an image. It occurs in the 10th mandala of the Rig Veda. Sri Aurobindo in Savitri is going to talk, even the Life Divine is going to talk about the ladder of being, which is really the planes and parts of the being that you are referring to, Julian. So this ladder of being is a static image. Yet it is an image which is definitely meant for climbing and descending. And therefore it represents an event in eternal time, an event in eternity. Another such image is Sri Aurobindo's symbol itself, which is a tantric yantra made up of two triangles, an ascending and a descending triangle. The word yantra itself means engine. And so this kind of an engine, it's an engine. It looks like a static image, but actually it's a dynamic image. It's an image of time. It's an event in eternity. In other words, it's a static image which captures the nature of time in a certain manifestation, in a certain cosmic becoming. In other words, what we are looking at is a being that is unordered, that is coming into a becoming that is ordered. And that becoming is couched in terms of time, but it is actually outside of time. It is both inside and outside of time. Our problem is that we are inside time. And hence, to actually intuit that status of the image that is outside time is a very difficult thing for us. Either we get out of time entirely, and that is where we actually lose the world. We lose the order. We enter into the being without any order, without any parts. Or we are stuck inside this time cycle. To start with, that particular idea of an image of time or an event in eternity is to think of the supermind. That kind of an image is what Sri Aurobindo calls a real idea. It's the idea of reality. It's already to connect the paradoxical eternity with the entire becoming of time. So it's important to begin with that. And I think the one other reason I wanted to begin with that is that today is Sri Aurobindo's Siddhi day. We know that it's considered to be the day in which the overmind consciousness entered his body. And I'd like to refer to that a little bit as we go on. But that idea is connected to the supermind, because that really is a decisive stage in the realization of supermind for Sri Aurobindo. And this is what the supermind is. This is the paradoxical nature of the supermind. It bridges eternity and time. Now, going to that, image, or going to that idea, we can now start thinking about what it means to come into the becoming and to come into an ordered manifestation with planes and parts. So, to think of that, I'd like to propose an image or an idea to think about somebody, a child, who is a prince and inherits a very large kingdom, but doesn't know what's in the kingdom. And if the child is to explore what's in the kingdom, to start with, the child sort of just goes about it in a random fashion, goes from room to room or place to place and enjoys whatever the child sees. But at a certain point, the child feels that this doesn't give a clear idea of what's in the kingdom. So the child has to create a system, a method by which to explore what's in the kingdom. And a system or method has to start from a certain definition of a zero, a ground zero. We have to begin systematically from denying what we have to put all the various contents in a graded fashion, a gradual fashion into that to get a full idea of what we have. See? So the idea of order, and a kind of order which begins from a ground zero, means that there is a faculty of order to being. Being cannot order itself unless there is a faculty of order in it. Some of this may seem obvious to us because we have minds. And this is really the beginning of the modern age with, the turn towards understanding the world as a displacement of the knowledge of God into the human. The human being, with the European Enlightenment, begins to think that I can know the world. I don't need some other, intervention, or I don't even need some God or some church, because the world is ordered and I have a faculty that recognizes order. I can spell out the order of the world. And this kind of a, hubris of the mind has happened before. It's not the first time. We are in the middle of it right now. This is the modern age. The modern age is an attempt to describe the orders of the universe, the planes and parts of the universe, though that is a slightly different kind of description, a material description. But nevertheless, that's what's behind it. It's a rationality. And so if we are talking about a rationality having ordered the universe, there must have been a rationality to being in ordering the universe. And this rationality is what Sri Aurobindo is calling the supermind. It is going through that process of self-seeing and self-manifesting. And what intervenes from the poet to the manifestation is the thinker. And this thinker is not the thinker that you and I are. It's not the mental thinker. It's the supramental thinker. It's the being that knows, sees, and manifests at the same time in the image of a real idea. You see, so this is important to understand from the viewpoint of planes and parts of the being. Why at all planes and parts of the being?
So Devashish, you said it sees
Yeah,
and manifests at the same time.
yeah, it sees and becomes at the same time, but what intervenes between them is the thinker. In other words, and this thinker is not the thinker of the human mind, but the thinker of the supermind that sees the whole of itself and manifests itself according to a certain principle that it has decided on, which is what is called the real idea. So, this ordering principle is a gradation of consciousness because that's the only way in which a systematic understanding of the contents of being can take place. You see, so it's as if there is something which doesn't have any gradation that sees itself as a gradation. You see, and this seeing is being done by a certain property that it has, a property that has got rationality. It's a supra rationality, but it's a rationality. This supra rationality can order itself because it sees itself according to a graded order. So that gives rise to the planes and parts of the being. Now, the one that didn't have any planes and parts is the truth with a capital T. You see, that is the reality. The reality has no planes and parts. But that reality can see itself with planes and parts for a certain reason. And that reason is the real idea through which it sees itself. The real idea in which we find ourselves is the real idea of evolution. Evolution is that graded self exploration of being. Being is exploring itself in a graded form, starting from a ground zero. Right? So now we may say that this self gradation of being, which occurs due to the properties of being, already has the manifestation implicit in it. And I'd say yes. So this is what Sri Aurobindo is saying, that it isn't that an illusion is cast out of being, but everything that can occur in being is already present in being and is already manifest somewhere. It's manifest and coming into becoming in a certain way. So we sense it in time. We are experiencing this moment together as if it's happening for the first time. And in fact, it is happening for the first time. It has never occurred before. And in that experience of time and in time, the divine is experiencing something new. You know, some people say the divine knew everything all at once. So why was there any need for a manifestation? The need for a manifestation is exactly the special ecstasy that we are having at this very moment, the bliss of this moment. It's the experience of time, the experience of immediacy, the experience of novelty, which cannot be had if you're experiencing this all at once and forever. You see, it's a special kind of experience. And so the other question that's asked is why? Why would the divine want to do this? And the answer is for no reason. For no reason, it's causeless. But if we want to find a analogy to why the divine does this, we can ask ourselves the question, why do we sing in the bathroom? Or why do we sing at all? We sing, we write poetry, we do many other creative things for no reason at all. We do it for the bliss of doing it, for the joy of doing it. And so we see right away that one of the primary properties of being implicit in this being without planes and parts is delight, is joy. that property is making it manifest, whatever is in it. So, going from that kind of state, looking at the two side by side, looking at the being without planes and looking at the world with planes through the real idea, first we have to think of what are the primary properties of that being, that the being without planes and parts. And we just saw one of its primary properties is joy. The primary property of joy is something that we understand very well. The mother says that the two really most interesting features of our cosmos are freedom and joy. Freedom and joy are at the very fundamental basis of our cosmos. And we can now look at how the early texts that Sri Aurobindo is referencing, like the Veda and the Upanishad, think of the properties of original being. So the first way in which the Veda talks about these properties is through three terms: Satyam, Ritam, and Brihat. And Sri Aurobindo sees these as the properties of supermind. But that's the way in which the Veda sees it. Satyam means truth. Ritam means ordering. It's the ordering principle. And Brihat means vast, vast. Now, when we come to the early Upanishads, the first description we have, today we know the three terms Sat-Chit-Ananda. But Sat-Chit-Ananda did not emerge immediately. It took some time to emerge. The earlier description of being in the Upanishads was Satyam Jnanam Anantam. Satyam Jnanam Anantam. Satyam retains the Satyam of the Veda, which means truth. So it is true, it is reality itself, it is true, it is truth. But from the ordering principle, we've moved to knowledge. It's a very interesting move, because one of the ways in which I'm studying these texts is to look at the sociology of language. What does language represent in terms of sociology? So we find that Vedic society had already become very ordered. Order became a really important feature of Vedic society, since it was symbolically structured according to the caste system, and this system had become quite fossilized by the time of the Upanishads. We think that it was the Buddha who really ruptured this system in his thought, but this was happening for quite some time. The Upanishads were already doing this. So we find that Ritam is replaced by Jnanam. In other words, the ordering principle comes later. First comes the knowledge principle. How do we know ourselves? And it's a very significant shift, because Vedic society, by the time the Upanishads come, is much more interested in order. It's telling people to obey the order, basically. And Upanishads are saying it's much more important to have knowledge than order. Order is going to come out of knowledge. So, know first. See, so that's why their description of being has these three properties of Satyam, Jnanam, and Anantam: truth, knowledge, and infinity. Now, this will later become Sat, Chit, and Ananda. So Sat is translated as being. So pure being, pure being. Chit is consciousness. And Ananda is bliss or delight. Sri Aurobindo will point out that the early use of the primary properties of being in the Taittiriya Upanishad, which are Satyam, Jnanam, Anantam, or truth, knowledge, and infinity, is no different from truth being, consciousness, and bliss. They are objective and subjective sides of the same thing. An objective description of being is that it is truth, it is self knowing, it has knowledge, and it is infinite. Sri Aurobindo shows that the subjective reality of truth is being. It is. The subjective reality of knowledge is consciousness. Without consciousness, you cannot know. You are conscious, your inner condition is consciousness, therefore you can know. But the most interesting of these three is the equation between infinity and bliss. And in the Life Divine, Sri Aurobindo is going to point out something which the Mother speaks about as well. Mother speaks about it in an even more telling way. She says that every time we break a limit in our own understanding and in our own existence, we experience bliss. Bliss is very closely related to our experience of freedom. Every bondage that is broken is subjectively experienced as blissful. And that being that has no horizons, that has no limits, that is radically infinite, has bliss as its intrinsic experiencing quality. See? So this is the reason why bliss is the fundamental subjective property of pure being. See? Now, we go back to what I said about why manifest. And as I said, there is no cause, no necessity for manifestation, but there is the bliss of manifestation. So we can say that of these three principles, these are properties. Today we talk about them almost like a hierarchy, Sat-Chit-Ananda or Satyam, Jnanam, Anantam. But to the being without sinews, to the being without planes and parts, they are equally properties of itself, primary properties of being. And as properties of being, any one can be primary. There can be any kind of ordering. Being may take its seat in Sat. Chit and Ananda then become secondary to Sat. Being may take its seat in Chit. Sat and Ananda then become secondary to Chit. Being may take its seat in Ananda. Sat and Chit then become secondary to Ananda. Let's go back to what the Mother was saying. What is the most interesting thing about our creation, the universe in which we find ourselves? Are joy and freedom. Now, if we look at the descriptors of being, we see the two are actually the same. Anantam and Anandam are really the same. Anantam or freedom, infinity, is the objective side for the experience of bliss. You see? So, the most interesting thing of our creation is the third principle of the Sat-Chit-Ananda. It is Ananda itself. And therefore, the being takes its seat in Ananda of the three principles Sat-Chit-Ananda to begin manifesting this creation. That is its primary seat. And the organ with which it manifests is the supermind. The real idea, as we were talking about these images of time or the events in eternity. The event in eternity is the being seated in Ananda, utilizing its faculty of knowledge to come into becoming. You see. Now, how is it doing that? That, as I said, depending on where the being seats itself, the other two become its secondary properties. The being seated in bliss is going to utilize Sat and Chit as its primary properties and mobilize them through supermind to make a manifestation. Sat and Chit are pure being. Remember, we talked about the being without any planes and parts. That is Sat. Sat is the presence of pure being, even in the gradations of being. So, even if we talk about a graded becoming, at the peak of that is the being without any planes and parts. It's a fractal definition, or what one might call a recursive definition, a definition in terms of itself. The first term of the being without any terms is the being without any terms. You see, this is the fractal definition. So now the next is consciousness. That being is conscious. So its bliss is mobilizing its consciousness through the supermind to create the orders of becoming. In other words, it is grading itself. It is becoming a graded being. It is creating a gradation of planes. And the gradation of planes is a gradation of consciousness, because it has to systematically come down to a ground zero. And that ground zero is going to be the semblance of the disappearance of consciousness, the opposite of being itself, the opposite of conscious being. So it is going to be being without consciousness. That is the nature of matter. Matter is. That is the one thing we can say about matter, that it exists. It is. It is even before we are here. It is before any life emerges. At that point, all we can say about it, looking retrospectively, looking back in time, is that it is. See? Now, in that condition, it is pure object. Its subjectivity has been completely submerged and made latent, so that it is pure object. Consciousness has completely withdrawn itself. And that forms what we call the ground zero for the self-exploration in a systematic fashion of being, which is another word for the evolution. So that is the first basis. And we can say, we can look at this motivated by Ananda or bliss, this action of consciousness to call being into becoming is really taking place through consciousness creating these gradations of consciousness. It is consciousness that creates these gradations of consciousness. Therefore, it is as if consciousness limits itself. It is infinite consciousness, but it limits itself into these grades of consciousness. This is the reason Sri Aurobindo uses the term the holocaust of Prakriti, which precedes the holocaust of Purusha. Holocaust of Prakriti precedes the holocaust of Purusha, because consciousness is the creative principle. Bliss motivates the creative principle to create the gradations of being. And therefore, it is the mother's holocaust first, the mother's holocaust that creates the ground zero of forgetfulness, amnesia, self-loss, from which being can start emerging. Into this self-loss, pure being that is seated in the principle of Ananda or bliss fragments itself. This is the sacrifice of Purusha. It fragments itself. In other words, from its oneness, it becomes infinite particles. And it is present in every one of those infinite particles. This is why we can talk about the ground zero as an oblivion of being and a fragmentation of being. These are the two forms of loss that have taken place. Consciousness has become completely unconscious. The one has become infinite and lost its oneness. Out of this condition, the other gradations of consciousness are going to emerge. But because it is bliss in which being took its seat, there are two kinds of evolution that are taking place. The evolution of consciousness, really evolution of Prakriti, and the evolution of Purusha, or the evolution of person, that is present as bliss in every particle. In us it is present as bliss as well, and that bliss principle as the person within each of us is what is the psychic entity, what Mother calls the psychic entity. So the psychic entity is evolving through history in its relationship with the gradations of consciousness as they are evolving from matter up the ladder of being. That is the way in which consciousness has graded itself. And as it evolves, it puts on the properties of that particular consciousness through which it is traveling. See? So we have, as it were, matter itself as that ground zero that houses within itself all the other gradations of consciousness, and it houses them gradually in an evolution that seems to have freedom to take its time to explore the various ranges of being. See? Now, there is a fundamental difference between pure being that we talked about without any planes and parts, the structure of planes and parts that is seen all at once by consciousness, that is creating a gradation of consciousness, and the material principle, which is the ground zero of the exploration. In other words, exploration can take place at any point or any plane. Exploration of being can take place in the pure being, in pure consciousness, in bliss, in supermind, in the principle of mind, life, and in matter. But before matter, in all these other principles, exploration of being is conditioned by the kind of consciousness through which being is allowed to come into becoming by the pure consciousness, by Chit. In other words, these are limited to their own kind of consciousness. On the other hand, what distinguishes matter as the ground zero is that it can receive every other kind of consciousness into itself. Going back to our analogy of the child prince that is exploring his infinite kingdom, each one of these levels of consciousness can be thought of as a specific room. So the child goes into a room and explores all the things in that room, but doesn't know anything else that's outside that room. But matter is a special kind of room. It's like saying that this is a room in which all the other rooms enter. And not only do they enter, they interact with each other. You have the ability to play with things from different rooms in this room. See? And that is the way in which material reality has a possibility of becoming that is quite different from the becoming of these other planes. The becoming of the material reality is an evolutionary becoming. This is the reason why it is a special kind of evolution that is motivated by the real idea of evolution, for which I feel that the best symbol of that, the image of time that I was talking about, that marks our existence in matter, is the symbol of Sri Aurobindo. It is an evolution that is being conducted through a dynamic of aspiration and grace. There is within this loss and fragmentation in every particle a kind of amnesia which is being mediated by a remembrance, and that remembrance is the fire within. That's the principle of the being that is bliss itself, that has entered into every particle. It's calling to its origin, it's aspiring, and that call to the origin is causing the other rooms, the gradations of consciousness, to descend into this particular state zero. Every descent into state zero manifests those particular forms of consciousness in the state zero. I'd like to go back a little bit and condition what I said about the various gradations of consciousness. I said the becoming of each of these gradations is purely at that level. There is no evolution. Each one of them only manifests its kind of consciousness. But at the same time, we have to recognize that it's being that has entered into every level of consciousness. Consciousness grades itself and creates levels of consciousness. But the entirety of being enters into every one of these consciousnesses. It's like saying, I offer you this mask. Will you wear it? And being says, yes, I wear it. In wearing it, being puts on a certain appearance. But the entirety of being is present in that appearance. However, it cannot manifest because the rules of the game don't allow it to manifest anything other than the mask it puts on at that particular level of consciousness, except at the level of matter, where it, in a graded fashion, wears the successive masks of consciousness. And it can even come to a point where it juggles these masks. It can scramble the planes of consciousness. So, this is a very important point. This point is being made with regard to planes and parts of being. It's being made by Sri Aurobindo as the only reason and the only way by which those who have access to the various planes in themselves can communicate with all the levels of consciousness. Because at every level, we have all the levels of consciousness. Matter has in it latent all the 7 principles: matter, life, mind, supermind, bliss, consciousness, and being. And every level also has these others. But these levels can't manifest them unless material beings that have access to these various forms of consciousness can mobilize these forms of consciousness in the other levels. This is the cross connection of consciousness that takes place between levels. See, we have, even in matter, we have material consciousness, we have a vital material consciousness, we have a mental material consciousness. So too in life, we have a material vital, we have a vital proper, we have a vital mental. We similarly in mind, we have a material mind or a physical mind, we have a vital mind, we have a mind proper. However, at that point, there is a lid. And this is the thing about the being and the becoming, the gradations of being as self limitations of consciousness occur due to the power of consciousness to do that to being by creating a lid between what it calls the truth or the knowledge consciousness and the ignorance consciousness. In Sanskrit, they call it Vidya and Avidya. So we are within the Avidya. Now, the whole history of Indian philosophy and world philosophy sees this condition of ignorance as a permanent condition. It sees that these principles are forms of consciousness that have manifested, material, vital, and mental, are the description of our world. It's not going to go beyond this. Even Indian consciousness or the history of Indian spiritual thought sees it like that. It sees an outside to this. It talks about the lid of Maya. In the early texts, in the Veda and in the early Upanishads, they call it the golden lid. They don't use the word Maya. The word Maya occurs in one Upanishad, which is relatively late, but then it becomes more important later. The Gita uses the term. But we find that the early texts are calling it the golden lid. The Isha Upanishad also uses that term. So this golden lid intervenes. It's interesting that the mother will talk about the golden lid in her famous description of the descent of supermind in 1954, where she sees herself as a being of gold that with a hammer shatters the golden lid. That's what she shatters. It's the lid of Maya. And what comes flowing down is the knowledge principle into the ignorance principle. Between the ignorant principle and the knowledge principle, at the summits of mind, is the principle that is the transition between knowledge and ignorance, which is what Sri Aurobindo calls overmind. So, overmind is really something which mediates between supermind and the ignorance. Sri Aurobindo, before the mother came, he had already arrived at the knowledge consciousness, and he had come to know the gradations of cosmic mind that intervene between the ignorance and the knowledge. This is something new that Sri Aurobindo received in the Alipur jail from Vivekananda. He showed him these gradations of cosmic mind that are the incomplete evolution of mind on earth. Earth has evolved from matter through life to a certain range of mind. But human mind is still very short of the full capacity of mind itself. The ranges of mind that we are at the borders of are cosmic ranges of mind. This was what was intuited by Teilhard, the Chardin, who was using the term noosphere. And by noosphere, what he really means is cosmic mind. It is the beginning of the cosmic mind. We are at the cusp of the cosmic mind. Just beyond us is the range that Sri Aurobindo calls higher mind. And I believe that's what Teilhard was calling noosphere, that he intuited. There is an entire range of cosmic mind above that, different layers of cosmic mind, that Sri Aurobindo was shown by Vivekananda in the Alipur jail. And before the mother came, after he went to Pondicherry, he had climbed into those ranges and he had seen or connected with the supermind. He uses the term the tail of the supermind for the plane of consciousness called intuition, which is just below the overmind. So he was in the overmind and he had connected with the supermind. And the phrase that he uses for the period before the mother came, what was he doing? He says he was trying to supramentalize the overmind. In other words, he was trying to bring down the principle of supermind into overmind. Now, remember we started by talking about images of time or of events in eternity. And I said these events in eternity are taking place in supermind. So supermind is a consciousness which has generated these images. These images are self-seeings. This is the poet and the thinker that is looking at being and imaging it in a certain significant form, the form of evolution, and then bringing that into manifestation. And that manifests automatically. It is not through two steps of knowledge and event. It is a knowledge will. It's at once knowledge and will. Whatever it sees, it becomes. So the way by which it is doing that is something that passes through a projection device. It's almost like a projector. Just as we have movie projectors. If you project a movie onto a screen, and if by chance the beings on that screen become living or realize that they are living and they seek their origin, they're going to hit their image inside the projector. But they can't go beyond that. It's the projector that is projecting them onto the screen. They can know that they're being projected, but they're stuck in the projection. This is the problem of overmind. We are being projected through the overmind or from the overmind as the dynamic images of the supramental time image. To get out of that, we need to change the composition of the projector. We need to change the consciousness of the projector so that it knows that it is a projector. This is what Sri Aurobindo was trying to do during the period before the mother came, and he was having a really hard time at it because, as he says, anything that he did was immediately erased. One day he would do something and the next day it was back to status quo. He was not being able to make any progress. And the mother, after the mother came, they made a new beginning because the mother said, what we need to work on are two other levels. One is we need to plunge below into matter. We need to look for the immanence of that supermind in matter. It is also the Purusha underneath at the very basis of matter. And so what they started doing was actually not really going down there to awaken that, but to start creating a more purified cosmic subconscious. They were digging into matter to create a more purified cosmic subconscious. And the other thing that they started doing was to bring the psychic being in front. That from that point on, that becomes the teaching of Sri Aurobindo, which changes its focus to bringing the psychic in front. That happens after the mother's arrival, because to make this endure, this change of supramentalizing the overmind, by the way, does not stop. Sri Aurobindo was doing that till the end of his life. Even a little before he passed away, when somebody, Nirod, I think, asks him, what are you doing? And he says, I'm trying to supramentalize the overmind. But the reason he was doing the other things, bringing the psychic in front and clearing up the material planes, the subconscious planes, is that unless that work was done, it was not possible for the work above to endure. It could not endure. The ignorance was interfering with and changing whatever he was doing. You see? So this actually is the relationship between the supermind and the overmind. And after the mother came, Sri Aurobindo's modus became something that, the two things about the psychic being, the immanence of supermind, and then the third real important change was to understand the yoga in terms of three transformations. So it was a through three stages that were necessary to make the change endure. And these three changes were, first, the psychic transformation, secondly, the overmind transformation, and then only one could think of a supramental transformation. So what happened on this day, 24th of November in 1926, is that the second transformation completed itself in Sri Aurobindo. The overmental consciousness entered into his physical matter. It transformed his material consciousness, his physical consciousness. See? So this is the completion of the second transformation and prepares the ground for the third transformation. So in a way, this is a very momentous, that's why he called it the Siddhi day. It is really the completion of the preparatory yoga needed for the supramental yoga. The planes and parts of the being, as we know, are all within the ignorance. I mean, I'm not all. I mean, there are the planes of Sat-Chit-Ananda above the ignorance. The plane of supermind is the cusp plane between the knowledge and the ignorance. But matter, life, and mind that actually express the three modalities of nature, of inertia, blind dynamism, and ordered thinking, or the perception of order in things, but under the umbrella of the ignorance. In other words, still subject both to inconscience and to multiplicity, not having the full consciousness or having the full unity, would have remained just like that unless something from the overmind started descending and opening up, widening the possibilities of matter, life, and mind. This has happened to a large extent today. This is one of the real interesting reasons why, from the point of view of yoga, Sri Aurobindo does not insist on the rise of the Kundalini from the base of matter to span the planes and parts of the being in the individual. We all have our centers of being. All these 7 centers are in us. Though because we are in the ignorance, our 7 centers are limited to matter, life, and mind. The lowest center is connected to the plane of matter. And as Sri Aurobindo and the mother both were pointing out, there are at least 2 other material centers that are not talked about because the traditional yoga is done with legs folded. We don't do a standing and a dynamic yoga. So we miss out on one center at the level of the knees and another center at the level of the ankles. These 3 centers, center at the base of the spine, at the level of the knees, and the level of the ankles, connect us to 3 levels of material consciousness, down to the inconscient. Then we have 3 levels of vital consciousness. One is at the sex center, one is at the navel, and one is at the heart. So these are 3 levels of vital consciousness. One is the lower vital, and the sex center, the navel, is like a medium vital, and the heart is the higher vital. And then you have 3 mental centers. One is at the level of the throat, which is the center of the mental expression. One is the center between the eyebrows, which is the level of the mental will and perception. And the last is the center above the crown chakra, which connects us to the cosmic planes of mind. Now, all along, it has been supposed in the Indian tradition that we have to open up the lowest and cause the mother energy, the conscious energy that is latent, consciousness that is latent in matter, that is involved in matter, to spring up and unite all the levels, but go to sleep in the thousand-petaled lotus above the head. Sri Aurobindo is insisting on opening up the higher first. And Nolini Kanta Gupta, who was one of the first disciples of Sri Aurobindo, has given a reason for this. Sri Aurobindo himself does not explicate on why he is asking us to do this, except to say that it is the safe way. The other way requires a guru because it's a sudden upsurge of energy and can make you crazy. Some people can go mad, some people can even die, that there are all kinds of reactions. But Nolini says that the reason the emphasis on the thousand-petaled lotus is being made by Sri Aurobindo now is because of our present stage in history. We have come to a point in history when world history has made us much more global as mental beings. We today know what other beings in the world think. We have developed comparative studies. We have developed structuralist studies. We are trying to understand the principle of all things at one. We are looking for the hidden root of unity in understanding. See, this kind of an evolution of mental consciousness has brought us as a race, as a human race, very close to the thousand-petaled lotus, which is really a cosmic consciousness. We could say that the petals, the closed petals of the bud of cosmic consciousness are stirring in our particular moment in history. And if our aspiration goes to that, it will begin sending down its Shakti right from there. And this is what the dependence on Sri Aurobindo's yoga is for our times. Opening to that, we receive the various energies that will open up the different planes of consciousness inside us and connect us to the planes outside. So, this is in a nutshell how I see the planes and parts of consciousness and our relationship with them in the yoga of Sri Aurobindo. Now, what you started with, Julian, about awareness through the body and also of how we can, with our eyes closed or even ordinarily become aware of these other forms of consciousness is very important. I think to connect to any level of consciousness is a beginning at universalization. We have to open ourselves to other kinds of consciousness. But we should also be very careful that we don't open ourselves indiscriminately. We have a method to this opening up, and that's really why Sri Aurobindo is prescribing opening first to the Shakti above, which can come down, and also opening up the psychic being to allow the psychic to come to the front because it has the instinct of truth. It knows what to choose and what not to choose. These two processes create viveka. Viveka is discrimination. Discrimination is a kind of intuition. It's an intuition that tells us right away what we should do and what we should not do. And that is the guru within. Without that guru within, our opening to other consciousnesses is at best dangerous.